Well, thank you very much, Tate, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be here speaking to you today. I ought to mention that the purpose of my visit is to come to, every year I come to our trustees meeting for with the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute, and they send me to the US to make those meetings, but it's always nice to use this trip to talk about some of the research that I'm doing, some of the research that CAARI facilitates, and this is one where, as you'll see, the site that I excavate is multi-period, and with any multi-period site, it's something that you need a lot of collaboration. You need people who do specialized in a range of things. I can't do everything myself. So I really value the input of people like Tate, who's come to help out, and you'll see some of the complex things that he was working on in due course here. But today we're going to talk about one specific period of the site, the Neolithic period. But before we do that, I should point out that I'm not a natural person to be in things like the news. But the work that we've done in the past couple of years with our experiments have made the news. And of course, with publicity, especially on the internet, comes random acts of hatred and weirdness. Apparently, I am an effete racist snot, and this Cypriot Neolithic excavation is somehow associated with both the Minoans and Atlantis. I hope to show you a more sober view of the remains from the site of Prasteio Mesorotsos, and also to show you that, unlike some other commenters, I employ a wide range of specialists and look far and wide in search of comparanda related to the interpretation of our remains. Now, with publicity comes risk, and it has been long been a concern of mine that the site that I direct is in a vulnerable position. The more people that know about the site, the more it comes to the attention of those who might do it harm, either by good intentions or bad. After the 2009 season of excavation, for instance, what you see here happened. We had thoroughly backfilled soil over a tarpaulin, covering it so that the weather, burrowing animals, and curious passerby would not disturb our ongoing work. About 1 month after our season had finished, I took a group to visit the site, and we came across what you see here. Someone had pulled back dug out the backfill, partially removed the tarpaulin, taken a big pick to the remains beneath, and destroyed some of the context, removed groundstone tools, and destroyed archaeological features and intact stratigraphy from this prehistoric trench. Of course, much of what they found lay left behind, and you can even see on the side of the trench some groundstone tools that were left behind. Because there was no gold or jewels, but the amount of lost information and the setback it represented for us was heartbreaking. I know the name of the perpetrator. I know who did this. I know where he lives. I know that he has a history of looting in the region, and specifically at this site. Plus, he was the only local Cypriot who came to visit us during our first excavation season. I knew who he was, and he brought his son, and he was pointing out objects in the trench to him while we were working there, seemingly training him to become a looter like he was. I tried to communicate with him, but he already had a relationship with antiquities that had involved him, one of which had involved him going to jail and receiving a fine. This was a situation that I was not responsible for, but that I nonetheless found myself in. Since 2009, therefore, I have come to realize that there is virtually no way to stop dedicated looters, developers, or vandals without the help from the local residents. I recognized the need to engage the local community, and I saw that my activities were removed from everyday life in rural Cyprus. I was wary, however, about giving too much information to the public that might encourage either looting like this or even haphazard visitations that could cause further destruction. So I've been looking for something that has the right combinations of elements to make the archaeology seem more valuable in the ground, something that would make it more beneficial to protect the site than to loot it or allow it to be destroyed. Archaeological treasures are a mixed blessing. They are exciting finds that capture the interest of many people, but they also attract the looters to a short-term payoff in the black market sale of antiquities. The real treasure for us archaeologists, of course, is the information that archaeology can reveal. But communicating this is tricky, and I hope to show you one way that I think that we've found is possible. So, the information on the location of the site itself was even something that I had to carefully think about, because as you will see, it is in a location that is hard to monitor and police, but also accessible enough to visit and potentially disturb. So let's start big in regard to the site's location. The site is in Cyprus, and I hope you'll forgive me for giving a little geography lesson, but as the director of CAARI, I know very well that the US media generally has a hard time with Cyprus. For instance, National Geographic had a series on the travels of St. Paul, although Cyprus was the very first place that he and Barnabas converted to Christianity. Not only did they omit Cyprus from their discussion, they also omitted Cyprus from their map. I assure you that 2,000 years ago, Cyprus was there. Also, when a Nicosia football team made the Premier League and played Real Madrid, it was made international headlines, but apparently CNN thought that Nicosia, the capital of Cyprus, was in Sicily. So with this in mind, I'll show you a few maps to show you that Cyprus is an independent country in the far eastern Mediterranean. Although Cyprus today is an EU country with a plurality of cultures in terms of language and society, including a majority Greek-speaking population and a minority Turkish-speaking population, and a smaller number of Armenian, British, and other groups. In deep antiquity, it had much more to do with the Middle East. This is understandable given its proximity to Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. In the Neolithic period in particular, there is mounting evidence that the idea that Cyprus was a latecomer to the agricultural revolution is false, and that seafaring and the colonization of the island of Cyprus was a major part of the phenomenon that led to sedentism and the domestication of plants and animals. The site that I direct in Cyprus has given us new information about how this phenomenon occurred in Cyprus. The site of Prasteio Mesorotsos is located in the west of the country in the Paphos district, about 15 kilometers inland in the perennial Dionysos River Valley, at the mouth of which is the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Palais Paphos, with the famous birthplace of Aphrodite and her first and most important temple in antiquity. The site surrounds a prominent rocky outcrop, which we will see in a moment, and it is located in the great bend of the river, occupying the most important topographical and strategic position in this valley, and one of the most important locations in the west of Cyprus, as it is a fulcrum between east and west, forested mountains and the coastal plains, and is itself a lush ecotone. And here is the site. Prasteio is the modern village, and that's where the site is located with the red oval. Cyprus has been an island for at least 1 million years, but probably more like 5 million or more. But people did not arrive onto the island until around 12,000 years ago. These first visitors were nomadic and did not practice herding or farming, as that had not really been established yet. These people were probably not permanent inhabitants, rather seasonal visitors that occasionally came to the island to hunt and get resources. They came from all over the coastal Middle East, including Anatolia and the Levant, and their visits spanned a very long period of time. The first groups to come for longer stretches and possibly permanent inhabitation came a bit later in the Neolithic period. These Neolithic people were amongst the first in the world to have practiced herding and farming, equal in date to the earliest evidence from the mainland. Another way to look at this timeline can be seen here. The period we will be focusing on today is the pre-pottery Neolithic B period from around 8000 BC through the later aceramic Neolithic, also called the KHIROKITIAN in Cyprus, to the late Neolithic or ceramic Neolithic when we see the first pottery on the island used. The site of Prasteio Mesorotsos is a multi-period site with evidence for a mostly unbroken sequence of occupation dating from the PPNB until 1953 AD, with the exception of the Late Bronze Age, when the inhabitants likely left around 1700 to move to the coast to become part of the community that would eventually build the first temple at Paphos. The first people to come to this location arrived at a time when domestication and farming were part of life. And with this in mind, you would think that every site that someone would dig in Cyprus in the Neolithic period would have similar qualities. Apart from the artifactual evidence which shows commonality between sites, each site, rather, seems to have its own unique character. There is a plurality of site types in this period. Some permanent settlements, hunting camps, places where certain types of resources were gathered, sometimes seasonally, and there are apparent ritual places that brought people to certain locations. Now, here is a cluster of images of different types of sites, including the earliest wells in the world, hunting camps, inhabitations made of wood and mud, inhabitations made of stone, places that were clearly the focus of resource acquisition like ochre, chert, plants, and animals, coastal sites that accessed marine resources, inland sites that were for cattle and sheep or goat herding, agricultural sites, and seasonal plant gathering sites. Now, these are purposefully anachronistic here. They're sort of jumble of all Neolithic periods because we presently have a palimpsest of information, with some sites overlapping in time, some short, some long-lived, and some even periodically inhabited at different times. The point I'm trying to make is that we really have no overall picture of what life was like in the Neolithic period. It seems like every time we put a new spade in the ground in the Neolithic, we come up with a new set of data that doesn't really jibe well with the rest of our information. Now, I don't want to paint the picture that archaeologists are not thoughtful, but we do like to classify things. It's helpful. But classifications tend to split the world into mutually exclusive categories. For instance, a community cannot be both mobile and sedentary. It cannot be ritual and functional. It cannot be autonomous and also interactive. I propose that a rigid adherence to these categories is unhelpful, and we can think in terms of seasonal mobility with recurrent inhabitation, sites that have a mundane function, but that this function can also have a ritual or spiritual element. And that while certain communities might have different ways of life, they can also connect via interdependence, occasionally benefiting from each community's special character via moments of interaction. This might sound a bit obvious, perhaps, but without evidence for the interaction between communities, how do we find evidentiary support for this interpretation? A person digging at a site tends to see the Neolithic world through the lens of that community that they're working with. What is necessary to tie all of these disparate strands of evidence together is an archaeological discovery that links all of these communities. But this is something that's hard to just seek out. We have to await its discovery. In a moment, I'll show you what I think is just this kind of discovery. Now, the site of Prasteio Mesorotsos is pretty big for prehistory, up to a total of 10 hectares at its largest extent. We began to excavate Prasteio as a multi-period site, which meant that we needed to treat each period the same and to look at the very long duration. We expected to see an inhabited area and hoped that we would understand the relationship between the inhabitants and the surrounding landscape and environment through time. What we did not expect, however, was to find that this site acted as a type of central place in the region. But through time we began to see that the inhabitants not only found an ideal place to settle, but also found that there was more in terms of ritual importance. This shows the surface collection of chipstone tools across the site from 2008. You can see that there are two halves. On the east surrounding a rocky outcrop, on your right-hand side, and on the west on some gentle slopes coming right down to the waters of the Dionysos River. In between is a sort of inaccessible area, a gully filled with pricker bushes that I challenge you to go into and search for chipstone. But in the Neolithic period, the community really only used an area surrounding the big rocky outcrop, which is the major topographical feature in the landscape. Let us first look at an area of excavation called Area 5-6, which is situated immediately below the sheer cliffs of the rocky outcrop. Because of the slope, we have employed a step trench method that allows us to investigate a long sequence of occupations simultaneously. But this limits the total exposure of each period. Thus, we are getting a good understanding of change through time, but in each period we are only getting really information seen through a keyhole. Here's another view of that from below, and you can note the rocky outcrop starting just upslope. And this shows just how complex and compact each stratum is, and how the erosion cutting the site obliquely has damaged virtually every period, and we must contend with this taphonomy in every phase. That said, in our earliest periods, we have been able to pick apart the strata to confidently reconstruct a sequence, including PPNB, ceramic, and KHIROKITIAN Neolithic and late or ceramic Neolithic phases. In each phase, we have identified things like houses, domestic features, and ritual components that were used throughout. This slide shows the earliest inhabitation we have found so far is a pit house or domestic activity area, at which at some point a domed or tannour-style oven was built, which is not on here. I've got a pointy stick, which I will just point out. We'll see this in a moment, but you can see this little circle that's been cut into, and that's again right here, that gray ashy area. Come back to that. Also at this time, the area outside of the workspace or house was used to deposit special broken objects. In this earliest period, occupation of the site was seasonal, as seen as a series of inhabited strata interleaved with sterile winter washes. People kept coming back to this place time and again, but they weren't there permanently, maintaining both the tannour oven and the small pit complex into which they continued to place special broken objects. This behavior continued until the surfaces around the oven had accumulated so deep that the flue on top of the oven was necessary to access it, as the front opening was no longer accessible. This activity continued through the KHIROKITIAN Neolithic and into the late Neolithic, ceramic Neolithic, at which time we see a house or covered activity area and probably a permanent settlement at this time. So here's the oven excavated. It was not huge, probably used for domestic scale cooking of some sort. And I hope at some point to reconstruct this and investigate the function of this oven in a future season. We haven't done this yet. So watch this space, I guess. Adjacent to the oven, and you can see just to your left-hand side out of the frame is where we're looking now, demonstrates that the community returning to this spot and conducting small-scale domestic cooking of some kind was, there was a remarkable maintenance of a ritual area with a series of small pits, cutting pits, cutting pits, cutting pits, cutting pits, into which were found broken objects that were carefully placed and left in this spot. Now, what is amazing is that this is not just a moment in time when ritual deposits were made. Indeed, the pits begin, the lowest one there you see with the picrolite small bowl is from the PPNB. It continues through the KHIROKITIAN Neolithic when probably a whole head was placed into one of these pits. And then we have a ceramic bowl from the late Neolithic in the top frame, and here are those again cleaned up. And just this season, Tate Paulette was working in this trench, a very complex series of pits, and we found our first figurine fragment, a Neolithic figurine where you can see the toes and a leg and part of a pubic triangle of a large ceramic figurine from one of our late Neolithic pits. If we were going to find a figurine, it was going to be here, really, because this is where all the special objects are being placed. So, this series of ritual deposits represents up to a couple thousand years of repeated ritual activity, demonstrating not only that this was a special place, but there was social memory and continuity here, too. In the PPNB period, occupation was seasonal, but this place clearly took on a special significance such that ritual activities took place that were important enough to remember from generation to generation. And here is some of the earliest Neolithic things that we have with lunate and microlithic tools and incised pebbles and ornaments that are reminiscent of Calabasas tenta, which is also PPNB. We also have a radiocarbon date from a human tooth, which unfortunately came from a redeposited context, but it confirms human activity in the period right at the cusp between the late PPNB and the beginning of the CAARI period, or roughly in line with Calabasas tenta phase 2, which you've seen parallels to just in the last slide. In the CAIROKITIAN Neolithic, which is also aceramic, we clearly see continuity from the preceding periods and greater investment in this location in terms of inhabitation. It is likely that it was either permanently inhabited or certainly longer term by this point, but we know for sure that a community or communities had a special relationship with this place, that they developed elaborate artifacts for use at this spot. By the ceramic Neolithic, we have clear houses with stone foundations, several phases of use in each house, and even a sequence of house builds, one on top of another. Here's some of our houses, and we have objects coming from there. This shows both continuity from the aceramic into the ceramic Neolithic and even into the early Chalcolithic period. So, how does Prasteio Mesorotsos fit into its landscape? If this was a place that was a draw to certain community or communities, it doesn't actually look like or behave like any other site. So again, in a pluralistic landscape, how does this fit in? Prasteio was in an ideal spot, really. It was resource rich, especially in terms of the Mammonia geological complex. Every type of stone or soil was available here. It is also in an ecotone between the upland forests and the lowland plains, and it occupied a place where the river slows down, creating an ideal spot for feral pigs and seasonal migrating waterfowl. The river was also perennial, and the rock itself, the Mesorotsos outcrop, was very visible, which was advantageous for hunting, connectivity, and as a regional focus. What we know about the region in the Neolithic period is not a great deal, but a couple of roughly contemporary sites have been investigated, including the site of Koletria Ortos, which was probably a chert gathering and working place and also inhabitation near the coast, and the site of Ruthias in the uplands, which was a seasonally used hunting camp dating back to the Epipaleolithic and into the Neolithic periods. Prasteio lies right in the midpoint between these sites, acting as both a fulcrum between the uplands and the lowlands, and also having its own unique resources and its own functionality not shared at the other locations. So from the immediate vicinity, we have evidence for seasonality and mobility from each of these sites. Some of the reasons for this mobility we can presume were hunting, resource acquisition, including agriculture and gathering and herding. There is no evidence for hierarchy or central authority in these communities, so the plurality of sites in this area must have meant that there were different zones that would have required negotiating territory. And to share the overall space, it must have meant both interdependence and exchange. But what evidence do we have for these negotiations, interdependence, and multiple communities coming together? I will argue in a moment here that intercommunity interactions were part of the fabric of Neolithic life in Cyprus. When multiple communities exhibiting different ways of life coexist in a region, there are a number of ways this interaction could take. But without evidence for these intercommunity interactions, we are left to speculate what happened and how. Here in the USA, a central important focus of identity comes from the first Thanksgiving, when Christian migrants who struggled to survive in their first years in the New World received help from native groups, resulting in the sharing of harvest that we still celebrate as a peaceful foundation of this nation. I believe that we've found evidence for feasting at Prasteio Mesorotsos that represents a similar sharing of resources and negotiating of the landscape that allowed for multiple groups practicing different subsistence strategies to coexist peacefully. To understand this, let's shift our attention to another part of the site, Area 7. It is situated in between the two peaks of the rocky outcrop on a flat saddle, which acts as a virtual amphitheater and sheltered area right at the heart of the big rock. You can see right at the bottom center of the frame where the trench is. This is taken from the top of the peak of the rocky outcrop down toward the saddle and the second smaller peak. This is a shot from the smaller peak toward the larger one. And this is working in the trench. Behind the trench is the sheer cliff of the main rocky outcrop. Behind and out of the shot is the smaller peak. So in the deepest part of this trench, we found some of our earliest artifacts that I showed you before, lunate and microlithic tools that derive from Paleolithic technology. We hope to have radiocarbon dates from this at some point soon, but at the moment, the earliest I would like to say is that we have PPNB. Unlike in Area 5-6 that you saw before, there is a break in the sequence here, a ceramic horizon that can be seen at this red line, below which not a single sherd has been found. Thus, below this stratum, we are directly into what is probably pre-Pottery Neolithic B levels at the latest KHIROKITIAN. Within these levels, and here's that ceramic horizon, we discovered a pit sealed below this ceramic stratum and cut from pre-Pottery Neolithic levels. Now, pits are interesting in their own right, but in time we began to wonder why such a huge feature filled with igneous stones and ash and nearly no artifacts was doing there. It took the team 3 full seasons to excavate this 3-meter diameter, 1.2 meter deep pit. It was full of stones, 90% of them igneous, either basalt or diabase, and ash, with just a few worked stones, some chipstone, a couple groundstone tools like rubbing stones, and a few fragments of animal bones, mostly pig, followed by deer, and then sheep and goat, which is consistent with what we find in this period across the site too. In 2014, we got to the bottom of this pit and discovered that it was not only filled with stones, but lined with stones as well. Flat igneous stones lined the entire pit and were carefully placed and set into the sides. The stones had been selected as large and flat, and all the stones, both the liners and the fillers, showed signs of having been burned in situ. This was a fire pit. But why the lining stones and the filling stones? Evidently, the fire went into the lined pit, and the filling stones were placed upon this fire. So I started to think about Hawaii, as you do. Although the original Cypriot kleftiko-style cooking means thieves' meat, and that derives from pit oven cooking, today the typical way to cook kleftiko is in a domed oven like you saw before. In other words, if we wanted to test this method of cooking to see how it was built, how it would work, and how many people it might feed, we would have to build one ourselves. I had never done this before, but I was familiar with Hawaiian imu cooking from luau's. This kind of imu or umu pit cooking is common in Polynesia, and certainly the remains were strikingly similar. That said, the Prasteio example was huge by any standard, probably at the theoretical limits of what was possible in this method of cooking. In order to cook meat in this way, the oven must contain the heat. And at this size, it was an open question as to whether it would work. I made the claim that it was probable that this was an oven, and for this I was branded an effete racist snot, as you saw before. But and also that I needed to get out and travel a little more to see that this was actually common in Hawaii. But what the commenters didn't know is that I actually did go to Hawaii in 2014. I know it's a hardship, and learned how to cook Polynesian style. So, because there were very few people who knew how to do this in Cyprus. But we'll come back to, I did have some help in Cyprus. We'll come to that in a moment. On the contrary, many, many Hawaiians cook this way every day, and there's also a lot of literature on the history of this way of cooking amongst Polynesian academics. So, in late May and June of 2015, before we started excavating, we held a 2-week experimental project to replicate this pit oven using traditional techniques. Sourcing and carrying stones from the riverbed, digging and lining the pit, sourcing wood and clay, tanning hides in the river, crafting mats to cover the meat. Many experimental activities went into this, and every aspect of this project had substantiation in the Neolithic remains from the site, including what would be cooked. There are no deer in Cyprus today, so we got a whole 70-kilo pig and a 40-kilo goat, and tried to cook it. So the replica oven was built at the restaurant located just adjacent to the site. This is an important fact that I'll return to in a moment. This is the owner, Christakis, who also happens to be the mayor of the village, another important point that I will return to in a moment. Now, the only cheat we used was to dig with metal picks and shovels. The justification for this was that we were experienced using these tools, and to make and become accustomed to stone tools would have been another experiment entirely, which we intend to do at some point in the future. Now, this pit was dug and only took a couple of days, but we also found that we needed to collect around 400 flat igneous stones in total, and we sourced local clay to act as a binder to set the lining of the stones. Now, the end result showed a pretty good facsimile of the original, the only difference being that we had a hard time sourcing stones as big as the ancient people were able to find. We also discovered many intangible things about the oven, such as once the oven was ready to be built, the dimensions would have been selected carefully. So the massive size was definitely intentional. So that this was for a large cooking inter-community feast now seems virtually a certainty. Now, an oven of this size would have been expensive in ancient terms, as it would have consumed a great deal of wood and other resources. There would have been good reason to build a smaller oven if this were for domestic scale construction, domestic scale consumption, let alone this being at the limits of how large an oven of this kind could get in terms of the ability to cook meat. A fire would have been having to go for 4 full days and 3 nights. On the first day, a fire would have been lit and maintained for 24 hours to dry out the soil and heat the rocks. The second day and night, a fire would have been maintained to create charcoal, and on the third day and night, a fire would have been lit on top of the oven while the meat was cooking. Thinking about how 4 full days and nights of a huge bonfire brought up thoughts about what it would have felt like to have participated in this feast. One can imagine dancing and storytelling, intermarriages between people from different groups. It definitely would have been a good party. So briefly, the method of cooking was as follows. We lit a fire to dry and heat the surrounding soil and the igneous stones lining the pit oven. Then the charcoal was made by lighting a fire of Mediterranean cypress and wild thyme kindling, which turned hardwood, lemon, and carob wood placed below into charcoal. A whole pig was stuffed with bulgur wheat, wild fennel, and wild oregano, and wrapped in wet burlap. The goat was the goat was chopped into pieces, flavored with wild oregano, and wrapped in goat hides that we tanned ourselves. Once the charcoal was formed on day 3, igneous stones were put on top of the coals. Then branches of fresh bay leaves, carob leaves, and mastic, Pistacia lentiscus, were laid down. The meat was placed in the oven and covered by more leaves, and then stones were placed on top along with a mud and clay mixture. To top it off, a fire was lit on top to bake the mud into terracotta, to seal the oven, and to trap the heat within. On the 4th day, we were ready to eat. And I have to say, at this point, I had no idea if it had worked. In 2015, we had invited hundreds of people, and around 200 people came. And when we pulled the meat out of the ground and we saw that it worked, my knees almost gave way with relief. And this year, we did it again. I'll come back to this in a moment. And I was equally relieved. Every time I do this, I'm pretty amazed that it works. So it was a very ceremonious unwrapping. Christakis, the owner of the Extreme View Cafe, where we built the replica oven, and who happens to be the Mukhtar of the village of Prasteio, had the honor of cutting the meat. He's in the upper left-hand corner there. But the success was not just mine and the Mukhtar's. I had a lot of help. George Dimitriades in the upper right was the real mastermind behind the cooking. He had actually done this kind of pit oven cooking in Cyprus before, and he told me all about the local plants and resources that were available. Also, the team, including hardworking supervisor Ali McCaig here on the right, and Dr. Lisa Graham, who was really in charge of running the experimental project, doing the recording, and also making sure that the whole feast was coordinated properly. Attending the event were archaeologists, some of whom you see here who are visiting us from the future, that is to say from the Bronze Age, in their plank figurine costumes. Also diplomats, Cyprus government officials, the interested public, international residents of Cyprus, and of course the local community. We asked for small donations of €5 per person for the feast, and 100% of this we gave to the Prasteio Town Council. The money we raised is a drop in the bucket for a council, but the gesture was clear. We archaeologists are not there to take, but to give. In this case, we are giving the information back to the community to use, both as an abstract idea and also as a tangible replica oven that the restaurant can use to cook future feasts, and to advertise their authentic history to tourists that rarely venture into the rural hinterland. The Neolithic party had music, feasting, and celebrated the revival of a Neolithic way of cooking lost for millennia and reclaimed by the local community once again. In this way, we replicated not only the ancient way of cooking, but also verified the use of the oven and the function of this location as a centralizing location, bringing together multiple communities to one place, mixing and socializing and combining different ways of life to create one group. So, what are the results of this experiment? Well, first off, it worked. Although nothing was obvious about this way of cooking, and it required a great deal of knowledge. Although once the correct procedure was set in motion, it almost could not fail. This meant that the Neolithic people had a very good understanding of the way that fire, fuel, oxygen, and cooking took place, and that they could ramp up the scale to the maximum extent. For up to 10,000 years ago, this seems remarkable, and I'm even impressed myself. Second, it was delicious. Each of the flavors of the aromatic herbs, the hard and soft woods, the leaves, etc., infused into the fibers of the meat, creating succulent and tender cooked pork and goat. We had accompanying Neolithic era vegetables, including fried fennel root chips, bulgur wheat, and barley dishes with wild fruits like the locally growing mespila. We had wild leaf salads and other accompanying dishes. Partly this was because we were afraid it wouldn't cook, and we had the Neolithic veggie option that was a fallback. We easily fed our 200 guests, and this year but we only used a 70-kilo pig and a 40-kilo goat in 2015. These are not huge by any stretch, and we easily could have doubled the output. The oven itself certainly could have fit another pig or larger animals, and in fact, in 2016, we added another goat to this mixed, and we had about between 300 and 350 people at this last event. And I'll come back to what that means for the community in a moment. So if you were using this many resources to cook, you might as well make as much as you can in one go. But in the Neolithic period, a community would not have had this many people. So this supports the idea that one single community would not have been the sole users of this oven. There's no way that Prasteio Mesorotsos had this many people existing there at any given time, unless it was for multiple communities. It's not hard to imagine the different types of communities lived in the area, practicing different subsistence strategies, converging on this spot to exchange materials, tell stories, develop friendships, resolve differences, intermarry, and have a bit of fun, as well as a bit of somber ritual. In this sense, the oven was not for cooking, but for feasting. The smaller domed oven was for everyday cooking, or it certainly could have been, and we will investigate that feature later. We don't have any direct evidence for what kinds of activities that would have been involved in the Neolithic feast, but our own experience acts as a guide to discussion of the topic. Apart from the basic facts of cooking meat, measuring how the oven was built, gathering resources, etc., it was the intangible experiences that told us the most from this experiment. For instance, stone gathering is hard work, and flat igneous stones do not occur in clusters. The one place where we failed was getting stones as large as the Neolithic people were able to use. This demonstrates just how much time and effort they put into getting it right. Stone gathering was probably something that occurred constantly, and when enough stones had been gathering, possibly over a course of years, the actual building of the pit oven only took a couple of days. With a big group of people, the tasks would have been spread out. But it was made big for a reason, to cook big. And once the fire got going, it would have been a sight to behold. Our team didn't hoot and holler around the fire, although in 2016 they did a bit of that. But one can imagine dancing and singing and drumming late into the night. The location in the valley would have heightened the dramatic qualities, and probably at certain selected times would have signaled the surrounding communities to converge on this known and respected place. And finally, we gave this information back to the community, who now lives at Prasteio village. In addition to being a genuine experiment that verifies the fact that the interpretation of this ancient feature is accurate, it was also a way to engage the local community to understand the history of their village and to become stewards of their own heritage. The upshot of this aspect of the project is this. The site needed something that was not an artifact, that gives the impression that archaeologists are treasure hunters who removed the best objects to museums, never giving back to the local community. It was important that the strength of the archaeological method is highlighted. In this case, a looter would have missed the true meaning of this ancient feature. They would have just dug through it as a pile of rocks. Also, something was needed that showed that the real treasure was the information that only scientific archaeology can provide, and that this treasure was put back into the community, trusting the local people to be its caretakers, stewards, and beneficiaries. This information needed to have some kind of authenticity to it, and we cannot force the evidence. And it also must be something that has the potential to attract people to the spot and to spend money in the local area, but importantly, not necessarily to go to the site itself and potentially damage it. So I should point out that this site is on one of Cyprus's agro-tourism wine trails. But as you can see here, in between Ios, Yorios, and Kedasi, you see nothing. Prasteio is right on that, in that gap there. Prasteio is passed over on the route, and they do not apparently get any economic benefits from this infrastructure. I'm pleased to say that in 2016, when we held this event, we had more than 300 people attending, and the restaurant made over 10,000 euros from one night of Neolithic feasting. This has now become their annual party, village party, and the focus for the creation of a new village identity. In this way, the replica Neolithic oven has created a link between archaeologists, the local community, and the past itself that creates tangible benefits for the people who live closest to it. Christakis, the Mukhtar and the restaurant owner, after the feast was done, said to me that he thinks his property is worth more now than before the archaeological work began. Truly, this is a surprising statement in Cyprus, and evidence that that community archaeology has produced a situation where the remains are worth more in the ground than outside of the ground, and where information is more valuable than destruction. So I'd like to thank all the teams that have worked at Prasteio since 2008, the Department of Antiquities, the President Community of Prasteio, and to all of you for your very kind attention. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Andrew. I think we have time for some questions.
You sealed your pit with clay. Did you find remnants of baked clay in the original pit, and what were the animal bones that you found there?
Well, we found very few things in the pit itself, and one of the things that we learned from doing the experiment is that in order to protect the meat from the dirt and the fire itself, because it's a method of steaming, we wrapped it in wet, moist burlap, and also with leaves around it. So when we removed it whole, and it was processed elsewhere. So in essence, you wouldn't expect to find any animal remains in the pit itself. But we did find a few, but I'm sure they were just part of general detritus from around that location. But what we found in the pit was consistent across the site, which shows in this order pig, deer, and sheep goat. Now, in terms of the clay, there's abundant clay sources, and we did find that there was, after a year of being exposed to the elements, a lot of that clay binder had eroded away, and we needed to rebind it. So this is an interesting development in that we didn't find, the stones were set into the pit, but they were much bigger, and so they were probably much sturdier when you set them in, where ours were much smaller, and we needed something to sort of support them a bit. There was some clay, pisé type material that was especially down at the bottom, but up toward in the original of the ancient pit oven, but up at the top it seemed to have eroded out. This is consistent with what we found after a year of exposure to the elements. So they weren't using clay for pottery or anything, but certainly they were for their structures, and we have our domed oven. They had a knowledge of how to use plastic materials like that. Mm-hmm. Yes?
What did you find in the surrounding area, in Area 7?
Almost nothing. We did find, because it's a keyhole, we're lucky to have it. Seriously, I mean, if we had been a few meters over to one side or the other, we would have missed it. Or maybe there's more around. It's a bit too late for us to, I don't want to be at this site for the rest of my life. So to open another trench or to expand it would be a huge endeavor, and so maybe that's for somebody else to do in the future. But no, we don't have, there's really very little. It just seems like flat surfaces. The only exception to that is that I think that when they dug the pit, they left, they piled up the remains of it into a little berm on one side. Maybe I can show you a picture of that. It's not really visible. Where is this? Over to the right-hand side of the old one, if I can point here. I think that when they dug this, they piled up the dirt over here. You can see that's slightly raised up higher. I think that that was left there and not smoothed out. There's some evidence from Polynesian cooking where they did this sort of heat shield, and they put vegetables in front of the oven to cook them much more gently than you would inside the oven itself. So I think that maybe that was a purposeful piling up of the soil that had been removed from the pit and placed to the side of it for another type of cooking. We haven't tried to replicate that, though, but there is literature on it. Yeah?
To me, it seems like a really, as I understand the arguments, that there weren't very many people actually living at this site during this period.
Right.
But because you're saying essentially to use an oven this big, you're going to be cooking a huge amount of food, so you're going to feed lots of people. So
Yes.
it makes sense that they'd be coming in from the surrounding region. Do you have any sense for how many times of oven were used?
Well, the big stones would probably hold together even better than our oven did. And also placing the stones that you've used for cooking, both beneath and above the animals that you're cooking, when you're done cooking, you pile them in there, and that will protect your lined oven. And that's probably why we found it the way we did, with just ash and heated stones. For whatever reason, they didn't return to it. But as I think you know, we actually left it completely exposed. We did not fill in our pit oven because the restaurant owners wanted to display it all year round. And so it was really exposed to the elements. And it still was in very, very good nick when we came to it again this summer. We had to empty out some of the cat poo and things like that. There was a bit of winter wash, and it had filled up with some water over the winter. But even with all of that bad treatment by the weather, it still required only a very little amount of maintenance. So, and with larger stones, I think it would even be more resilient. So we have no evidence for how many times it was used, but we do have some evidence for some reworking. So some of the stones that fell out of the top, like ours did after a year, I think this is just from after the first use, but you can see there's some stones in a gap here. We have some similar gaps in the original oven too that have fallen out, and presumably that would have been maintained and replaced. And we have a few cases where they used limestone, which is not an appropriate stone to use for this sort of a thing. So they actually put in they had a less than effective repair to it. So multiple uses for sure. How many? Impossible to know really at this point. And all we're going to get is if we get any dates from the interior of it, it's just going to be from its last use, is the best we can say. But if it's multiple uses, then when we get that date, then I'm hoping that we can contextualize that a little bit more. So, yes.
Thank you for the talk. I was just wondering, the assumption is that people were consuming that meat right?
Yes.
Around this.
Sure.
So what happened to the remnants? What happened to the animal bones? Did you find all this actually were accumulated and poured somewhere in the place? Because that's another technique that people use to mark the place, the landscape, to have a, kind of a kit with the results of that feasting event.
We haven't found anything like that. One of the problems with a multi-period site is that there's a lot of mucking about from later periods. And so for instance, the radiocarbon date from the human tooth that we got was found in a Bronze Age context. I had long thought that the Bronze Age people were using soil from somewhere on the site to build up a terrace when they started to develop more sophisticated architecture, and the objects we were getting from it were mostly Neolithic. And so I was convinced that this was a Neolithic deposit that the Bronze Age people had just dug up and put someplace else. And that radiocarbon date shows that. So we haven't found anything like that, but we've also got a lot of disturbance from later periods. The earlier you go, the more disturbance you get. And we're lucky to have this, that it is untouched. We don't have the animal bones that are placed in some sort of midden, but I think what you're saying about establishing things by putting used objects into pits, we have with the pit oven, or sorry, the pit complex, with this maintenance of a special place. This is where broken objects, even decapitated heads, can be placed into here, and that preserves sort of a continuity of memory of this importance of this place. It's not in direct relation with the pit oven, but I think that these two areas of the site are doing things both to that extent, yes.
Can I ask something small in relation to botanical finds? I mean, you're using your experimental with
Yes.
lots of herbs and other things you collected. Do you have any archaeobotanical evidence for specific use?
We have domesticated plants, barley and wheat and things like that, and we use that for the identification of what some of the plant food would have been like. What I'd like to see is our archaeobotanists see weed species to see if we can find what seasons, if there was a particular season that at least this last event came from. That would be really interesting. And in terms of what went into the oven, we were just guessing based on local plants that exist today and ones that might have existed or analogous to ones that might have existed in the past. So for instance, in Hawaii, they use banana leaves, but we didn't use that because those are definitely not indigenous to Cyprus. So we used ones that were Mediterranean, Cyprus, indigenous to Cyprus for the most part. So, but we don't have any direct evidence. What we found in the pit were not a great deal of seeds, mostly very fine ash, which is actually consistent with the charcoal that would have been put in there.
All right. Well, thanks very much again, and we have a reception afterwards.
Thank you.